Picture the British Empire in the winter of 1940. The maps still show oceans of red, millions of square miles, hundreds of millions of subjects, the greatest imperial enterprise in human history. And yet beneath that confident veneer, beneath the speeches, beneath Churchill's defiance, the empire was collapsing, not militarily, but financially. The bombs falling on London were terrifying. But the numbers on Treasury balance sheets were worse. The truth almost no one knew at the time was this. Britain wasn't just running out of planes, fuel, or ships. It was running out of money. Not temporarily, not symbolically, but mathematically. In the early months of World War II, Britain was still a global financial superpower. It held vast gold reserves. It owned profitable investments around the world. Its merchant fleet controlled global shipping lanes. Its currency, the pound sterling, functioned as an unofficial Second World Reserve. But total war changed everything. War in the 20th century was no longer manpower and muskets. It was metallurgy, engines, alloys, fuel, and logistics on a scale humanity had never attempted. Modern war demanded industrial acceleration at infinite speed, financed with infinite capital, at a time when Britain's industrial base was aging. Its workers were exhausted, and its colonies were increasingly rebellious rather than profitable. Worse still, Britain couldn't source what it needed from Europe. Hitler controlled the continent. Trade routes were severed. Imports dried up. And so the empire looked west, to the United States, its former colony, now the only nation on Earth capable of manufacturing modern war at volume. But the United States was not at war. It was not threatened. It was not desperate. It was sitting on a gold-backed economy and a booming industrial sector ruled by a Congress allergic to foreign entanglements and scarred by the trauma of the First World War. So America made its position brutally simple. You can buy whatever you need, but you will pay in cash, and you will ship it on your own vessels. No credit, no IOUs, no exceptions. This was the infamous cash-and-carry policy. It sounded neutral and fair, but the logic behind it was merciless. America would profit from war without participating. Britain would bleed cash to stay alive. So Britain did the only thing it could. It sold its future to pay for its present. Billions of dollars of gold reserves were loaded onto ships under naval escort, crossing an Atlantic patrolled by German U-boats. Entire vaults were emptied. Royal treasures were exiled. Centuries of wealth, earned through conquest, trade, and exploitation, vanished overseas. And even that wasn't enough, because Britain's wealth wasn't cash. It was ownership. Railroads in Argentina, oil companies in Burma, copper mines in Chile, factories in the United States, insurance syndicates in Canada. The empire's wealth was slow, long-term, structural, and non-liquid. But war didn't care about cash flow projections. It cared about bullets per minute. And modern industrial bullets, machine parts, airplane engines, tank armor required dollars per hour. So the British Treasury did the unthinkable. It began selling everything at fire sale prices during wartime in a buyer's market, with the entire world watching and whispering the same thought. They're desperate. Every sale was a humiliation. Every sale was irreversible. And every sale pushed London further under American financial control. Britain wasn't defeated by German military strategy. It was defeated by American financial leverage. By December 1940, the situation was catastrophic. Britain's reserves were gone. Its credit lines were exhausted. Its civilian economy had collapsed. Its military needs were accelerating. The empire had reached the unthinkable moment. A nation that had financed half the world for a century could no longer finance itself for another month. So Winston Churchill, a man famous for bombast and rhetorical swagger, wrote one of the most humiliating letters any British leader had ever sent. It was addressed to President Franklin Roosevelt. It didn't demand weapons. It didn't beg for soldiers. It didn't appeal to shared heritage. It said plainly, "We cannot pay. Not now. Not soon. Not ever. We are bankrupt." Historians often quote Churchill's defiance, his vow to fight on the beaches. They rarely quote his other truth, which was far more terrifying. We can fight, but we cannot pay to fight. Churchill wasn't asking for help. He was asking for rescue. He was asking Roosevelt to save not just Britain, but the financial architecture of Western civilization. But Roosevelt faced a problem just as severe. America couldn't give Britain money. Congress would revolt. The public would revolt. Isolationism was not just a policy, it was a religion. So Roosevelt needed a miracle. He needed a system that would let him supply Britain without looking like he was financing Britain. He needed a plan that would get America into the war economically, without getting it into the war militarily. He needed a plan that made aid look like trade, while transforming trade into power. So he invented one. A program that would change global finance forever, Lend-Lease. A program pitched as generosity, framed as practicality, sold with a folksy metaphor. You don't sell your neighbor a garden hose while his house is on fire. But behind that metaphor was a brutal reality. The United States wasn't lending a hose. It was buying the neighborhood. And Britain, with no money and no options, was forced to hand over the deed. Lend-Lease wasn't aid. It was foreclosure with a smile. It was a financial coup executed with legal paperwork instead of military invasion. Because Roosevelt and his Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau had a ruthless vision. If Britain survived, it would survive as a client state, a junior partner, a debtor. And if America was going to bankroll the survival of the empire, then America would own the empire's future. And that's exactly what happened. What followed wasn't just a bailout. It was the most sophisticated geopolitical acquisition ever executed. Britain survived the war, but it didn't survive the bill. Because the Allies may have defeated the Axis, but America defeated the British Empire, not with bombs or bullets, but with spreadsheets, contracts, and interest rates. Lend-Lease has been mythologized as one of the greatest acts of wartime generosity in human history. American textbooks frame it as charity wrapped in patriotism, a noble, altruistic lifeline extended across an ocean to a beleaguered ally. But the men in the smoke-filled rooms who negotiated it knew a darker truth. Lend-Lease was not a gift, it was a transaction. A transaction in which Britain was the desperate seller and America was the uncompromising buyer. Publicly, Roosevelt sold the idea as a moral duty. Privately, his treasury would set terms that would reshape global power for the next century. To access the pipeline of weapons, fuel, food, and machinery, Britain first had to submit to something unprecedented in modern history, a full-scale financial audit of its empire, not just of government accounts, not just of national reserves, but of every British-owned asset on Earth. Factories, shipping fleets, stock positions, resource concessions, colonial industries, private investments. anything that could be liquidated, seized, or pledged. The empire that had once dictated terms to the globe was now being asked to catalogue its wealth for a foreign power. And the man forcing this audit was Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, a mild-mannered New Yorker with a reputation for compassion, but a mind of mathematical brutality. His premise was simple. Before the American taxpayer pays 1 cent, Britain must exhaust every resource it possesses. This wasn't humanitarian aid. This was predatory lending with geopolitical ambitions. British negotiator Sir Frederick Phillips was horrified. He had expected solidarity, sympathy, some sense of shared destiny between democracies. Instead, he found himself answering questions like, how much wool can the Australian colonies ship? What are the book values of Canadian factories? What revenue do British holders extract from American companies? What is the liquidation value of gold mines, oil wells, telegraph networks? The British delegation realized, with growing dread, that they were not negotiating as equals. They were being processed. The United States wasn't helping Britain defend the empire. It was calculating how much of the empire it could acquire, and the price would be paid not in soldiers, but in shares. The core of Britain's wealth was not in Europe or even inside the UK. It was abroad, especially in the United States. In the early 20th century, British capital had flowed into America like a tidal wave. Railroads, steel mills, textiles, mining companies, telecommunications, energy systems. Britain didn't just invest in America, it built America's industrial base. For decades, profits from these firms had sustained British dominance abroad. To Washington, those investments represented collateral. To London, they represented civilizational lifelines. The most infamous battle over assets revolved around a company called American Viscose Corporation. A century ago, this was cutting-edge tech, a synthetic fiber empire producing rayon, artificial silk, and industrial textiles. It employed tens of thousands, controlled vital patents, and paid enormous dividends. It was owned, indirectly, by the British, and therefore, in Washington's eyes, it was a ledger entry waiting to be liquidated. Morgenthau demanded that Britain sell it, not negotiate, not delay. Sell it immediately. The reaction in London bordered on panic. Officials argued that a wartime sale would bring a disastrous price. They argued that a profitable post-war firm was essential to rebuilding. They argued that fire-selling assets would cripple Britain's long-term stability. Morgenthau responded with bureaucratic indifference. If you can afford to own it, you can afford to pay for this war. Washington knew Britain couldn't afford anything. Britain knew Washington knew, and America exploited that vulnerability with cold precision. Under immense pressure, the British government seized the company from its owners, forced a sale, and let American bankers set the price. They deliberately set it low. The company was worth over $100 million. It sold for roughly half. It was daylight robbery, legalized through emergency powers. And it wasn't the last. One by one, the jewels of the British overseas portfolio were stripped and sold. Chemical firms, banking stakes, manufacturing plants, utilities, mines, agricultural monopolies, capital built over generations was converted into dollars at a moment when each dollar was worth the fate of the nation. The United States didn't buy the British Empire in one bold move. It bought it piece by piece, through forced liquidation at pennies on the dollar. It was the largest economic transfer of private wealth in modern history, and it happened without a single headline. But America didn't just take financial assets. It took land, strategic land, imperial land, military land. The famous destroyers for bases deal is often taught as a triumph of wartime diplomacy. It wasn't diplomacy, it was foreclosure. Britain begged for destroyers to stop German U-boats from strangling Atlantic trade. America agreed to hand over 50 rotting, obsolete ships left over from the First World War. In exchange, Britain gave the United States 99-year leases on military bases across Newfoundland, Bermuda, Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Antigua, Trinidad, British Guyana. This wasn't charity. It was a colonial land grab executed under the cover of law. And the strategic value was immense. Those bases became the forward operating hubs that allowed America to project power across the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and eventually into the Pacific. They also became permanent footholds that would never return to British sovereignty. The insult was compounded by the absurdity of the trade. The 50 ships were so outdated that naval officers nicknamed them the Junk Squad. Britain traded long-term global architecture for literal scrap metal. But they had to. They had no choice. Without those ships, the convoy lifeline would collapse. Without the lifeline, Britain would starve. The empire was selling fortresses to feed itself. The country that once ruled the seas began mortgaging its ports to survive another season. America didn't conquer British territory. Britain auctioned it, and Washington showed up with the highest bid and the lowest price. Every British leader knew what was happening. They watched the empire being dismantled and sold, not to a rival, not to an enemy, but to an ally. Winston Churchill, a man of aristocratic pride, a man who dreamed in imperial metaphors, was forced to make peace with a horrifying truth. Victory now meant surrender later. America wasn't replacing the Axis, it was replacing the empire. The British elite whispered this in private. Never publicly, we are not fighting to save the empire. We are fighting to sell it. They were sacrificing everything, not just to defeat Hitler, but to avoid starvation, collapse, and revolution. Because the empire didn't fall in battle. It didn't fall from incompetence. It fell because its survival depended on a nation that demanded payment in power. Lend-Lease kept Britain alive, but it ensured Britain would never again be rich, independent, or dominant. It was not foreign aid. It was regime change through accounting. The closing months of World War II looked on paper like the triumph of moral resolve. Britain had endured the Blitz. Britain had outlasted Hitler. Britain had stood alone for 2 years when the rest of the world collapsed. And when American industry finally joined the war, it seemed like the two great English-speaking democracies had fought side by side to save civilization. But behind the victory parades, behind the flags, behind the speeches, there was a reality so brutal that British leaders could barely speak about it publicly. Winning the war did not save Britain. Winning the war bankrupted Britain. Because when you take a nation that imports most of its food, imports most of its fuel, has no industrial surplus, and has sold its overseas assets to finance a war, you don't get a post-war recovery. You get a post-war collapse. By late 1944, the structural damage was irreversible. Britain had lost its export markets. It had dismantled profitable industries to build weapons it could not sell. It had starved its domestic economy to feed its military, and it had become dependent on one source of financial oxygen: the United States. The British government understood the paradox. They had defeated a tyrant, but they had surrendered their independence. The price of victory was debt. And when the war ended, the most devastating blow was not delivered by Berlin, but by Washington. 7 days after Japan surrendered, the US government terminated Lend-Lease. Not gradually, not with a transition period, not with a plan. It ended instantly. Ships carrying food to Britain were ordered to turn around in the middle of the Atlantic. Factory shipments bound for British ports were cancelled mid-route. Bills for ongoing deliveries arrived in London, demanding immediate payment, as if the war was still raging. The British cabinet was stunned because they had assumed that wartime aid would convert into post-war support. They assumed that the common struggle had created a common destiny, and they assumed that the United States, the richest nation in human history, would not abandon a starving ally in the moment of peace. But America was not thinking about gratitude. America was thinking about cost. 3 years earlier, the British Empire had possessed the second-largest economy in the world. By 1945, it was a wreck. It could not pay for imports. It could not feed its people. It could not restart industry. It could not service debt. And it had no gold or assets left to sell. The only option left was begging for a loan. In late 1945, Britain sent its most brilliant economist, John Maynard Keynes, to Washington to negotiate. Keynes believed he had a moral argument. He believed that Britain had sacrificed itself to save the world, and that a gift, not a loan, was justified. He argued that the United States owed Britain $6 billion, not in gratitude, but in fairness. But American negotiators were not interested in fairness. They were interested in leverage. They offered a loan, not a gift. And they set terms that would guarantee Britain's economic subordination for decades. The loan amount was $3.75 billion. It would be repaid with interest. It would be repaid on a schedule. And it would be tied to conditions that would dismantle the last mechanisms of imperial economic autonomy. The most devastating of those conditions was something called sterling convertibility. In 1 year, every pound held anywhere in the world would become convertible into dollars at a fixed rate, meaning that every country in the sterling system could exchange their wartime savings for American currency, and then use that dollars to buy American goods. It was presented as free trade, but it was designed to destroy British trade, because Britain did not have export industries left. Britain did not have factories capable of competing. Britain did not have raw materials. Britain did not have shipping capacity. Britain did not have capital. Britain did not have time. Convertibility was a loaded gun pointed at the British Treasury. And Keynes knew exactly what would happen. The moment the pound became convertible, every nation that had accumulated pounds during the war would dump them for dollars, and Britain would not have the reserves to cover the exchange. The empire's financial system would collapse. Keynes called it suicide, but Britain signed anyway, because without the loan, the British would starve. In July 1947, sterling convertibility went into effect. The disaster arrived immediately. Billions of pounds were dumped. Dollars evaporated, and within 6 weeks, the system collapsed exactly as Keynes predicted. The government suspended convertibility. The loan, which was supposed to last years, was burned through in months. There was no money left. There was no empire left. There was no leverage left. The war was over, and Britain was finished. The political consequences were immediate. Britain sent word to Washington that it could no longer afford its global responsibilities. It abandoned defense commitments in Greece. It abandoned support for Turkey. It began unraveling imperial authority in India. It began accelerating decolonization, not out of ideology, but out of insolvency. Military retreat followed financial retreat. Geopolitical concession followed economic crisis. It wasn't Hitler who destroyed the British Empire. It was compound interest. And there was one more humiliation still to come. The British government believed that its sacrifice in the war would be honored with generosity. They believed the Americans would extend the loan, relax terms, or forgive payments. They believed friendship would override accounting. They were wrong. There was no forgiveness. There was no generosity. The loan would be repaid in full with interest, and that repayment would continue for 6 decades. Every year, from 1950 until 2006, British taxpayers made payments on the loan that kept them from starving in 1946. Entire generations who had no memory of the war, no link to the empire, and no stake in its legacy, paid for a conflict they did not fight. The American victory of World War II was not just military, it was financial. The United States emerged from the war with half the world's gold, half the world's industrial capacity, and the only functioning currency on Earth. The dollar did not become a global reserve by accident. It became a global reserve because every other currency was dead. Britain had won the war. But Britain had lost the world, and America, without firing a shot at London, inherited its empire, not by conquest, but by contract, not with armies, but with debt, not through invasion, but through liquidation. This was not foreign aid. This was a financial coup, executed with patience, strategy, and overwhelming economic force. And the empire that once ruled the seas, taxed continents, and dictated global trade, spent its final years paying interest to the very nation it helped industrialize a century earlier. If you want to understand modern power, modern finance, and modern geopolitics, you start here. Because this was the moment when global dominance stopped being about territory and became about liquidity. Not who conquered land, but who controlled credit. Not who built armies, but who built debt. Not who ruled the empire, but who owned the balance sheet. Britain won the war. America won the peace. And victory turned out to be far more profitable than conquest. If you're finding this fascinating, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part, because the story gets even more shocking. By the late 1940s, Britain was no longer the master of a global empire. It was a debtor state struggling to keep the lights on, struggling to heat homes, and struggling to feed its population. The country that had once been the banker of the world now lived on borrowed money, borrowed fuel, and borrowed confidence. The British public tried to celebrate victory, but the victory felt hollow. The peace they imagined never arrived. Instead, they were introduced to a period known simply as the austerity years, defined not by rebuilding, but by rationing, scarcity, and humiliation. Food remained rationed. Clothing remained rationed. Fuel remained rationed. Housing was inadequate. Factories were inefficient. Exports were uncompetitive. The country was trapped in a paradox. It had won a war it could not afford, and it had inherited peace with no resources to manage it. By 1947, the situation was so severe that bread, which had never been rationed during wartime, was rationed in peace. The public was speechless. In their minds, victory should have meant abundance. Instead, victory meant less. The British government tried to restart the domestic economy, but the economic structure simply wasn't ready. The industries that had once produced goods for global consumption were now configured exclusively for war. Converting them back required money Britain didn't have, labor Britain couldn't spare, and time Britain didn't possess. Even worse, Britain no longer had captive markets. Before the war, the empire functioned as a closed trading system. Colonies were forced to purchase British goods, even when better alternatives existed elsewhere. This system guaranteed demand. It provided dollar income. It supported domestic employment. It preserved the illusion of prosperity. But wartime liquidation and post-war convertibility agreements shattered that structure. After 1947, imperial markets were free to purchase American goods. And they did, for a simple reason. American goods were better. British factories were old, inefficient, and technologically obsolete. They produced at higher cost, lower volume, and lower quality. American factories, by contrast, had spent the past 5 years becoming the most technologically advanced industrial system in existence. American companies entered global markets with cheaper cars, sturdier tools, faster machines, more reliable appliances, superior chemicals, and abundant capital. British exports collapsed under the competition. The empire hadn't just lost its trading privileges, it had lost its economic reason to exist. And industrial decline wasn't the only pressure. There was a social crisis emerging. Millions of British veterans returned home expecting reward, security, opportunity, and dignity. Instead, they found unemployment, rationing, and a government financially incapable of delivering the prosperity they believed they had earned. The public mood shifted from patriotic pride to bitter realism. People who had endured 6 years of war demanded a reward. What they got was paperwork, austerity, and debt. The British state tried to soften the collapse by creating a welfare system. Healthcare became free. Education became supported. Housing programs were launched. But the state could not fund these systems without borrowing more money, taxing the remaining productive sectors, and deepening its dependency on American credit. Britain was trying to build social democracy with imperial revenue it no longer possessed. And at the center of this crisis was a currency system that no longer functioned. The pound sterling had once been the foundation of global finance. Central banks held it in reserve. Trade contracts were denominated in it. International confidence revolved around it. But after the convertibility disaster of 1947, the pound became a symbol of weakness. Speculators attacked it. Governments dumped it. Businesses avoided it. And the British government fought a losing battle to defend it. The solution they reached was drastic. In 1949, the pound was devalued by nearly 30% overnight. Before the war, £1 had been worth 4,086 cents. After the devaluation, it was worth £2.80. In economic terms, this made British citizens poorer instantly. Imports became more expensive. Living standards fell further. British households, already battered by years of war and rationing, now faced a reality where their money literally bought less of everything. But the devaluation revealed something deeper. Britain was not a country rebalancing temporarily. It was a country adjusting permanently to decline. The collapse of British monetary power had geopolitical consequences as well. Countries that once relied on British protection suddenly discovered that London could no longer finance foreign policy. It could not guarantee stability. It could not fund armies. It could not project force. And global rivals noticed. Across the world, nationalist movements accelerated. India had already broken away. Burma followed. Palestine collapsed into conflict. Egypt demanded control of the Suez Canal. Colonial administrators watched the empire disintegrate not because of ideology, but because of insolvency. Britain didn't grant independence out of morality. It granted independence because it couldn't afford empire anymore. Even its military posture changed dramatically. In 1947, Britain sent a message to Washington that it could no longer afford to support Greece or Turkey. The Americans stepped in, creating what became known as the Truman Doctrine. It was the beginning of the Cold War. It was also the beginning of a new geopolitical order, where the United States, not Britain, acted as the global guarantor of Western security. This was the real transfer of power. Not a battle, not a treaty, an invoice. Britain didn't lose its empire because it was defeated. It lost its empire because it could no longer afford to maintain it. And the irony was cruel. Britain had bankrupted itself, fighting fascism. Now, in peace, it was watching democracy dismantle its empire through markets, not weapons. Meanwhile, the United States, untouched by bombing, untouched by occupation, untouched by decline, emerged from the war with the world's strongest currency, the world's most advanced industry, the world's largest gold reserves, the world's most powerful navy, and a network of military bases that Britain had surrendered under duress. American economic power became American political power. American political power became American military power. And American military power became the architecture of a new global order. Britain had once shaped global capitalism. Now it was shaped by it. The empire didn't collapse suddenly. It decayed, gradually, quietly, predictably. And the victory that millions died for turned into a financial obligation that generations would spend their lives repaying. Because in the modern era, war doesn't just destroy cities. War destroys balance sheets. War destroys currencies. War destroys future earnings. The guns fall silent. The bombs stop dropping. The flags are waved. The speeches are made. But the debt remains, and the debt decides the future. Britain won the war, but America won the century, and the British wake-up call came not with invasion, but with invoices. By the early 1950s, the British Empire was still alive on maps, but dead on balance sheets. Politicians pretended that Britain was still a great power. Newspapers insisted the empire would recover, and school children continued to shade the world in pink. But economists, bankers, and treasury officials knew the truth. The country that had once dominated global finance was now operating on borrowed time, borrowed capital, and borrowed credibility. Britain's economic collapse wasn't an event. It was a process, a slow, grinding, decade-long erosion of wealth, capacity, and international influence. The British people lived through it in ways that did not feel like history. It felt like daily life. It felt like queues, ration books, shortages, power cuts, and disappointment. Britain's victory in 1945 had not liberated the population from sacrifice. It had extended sacrifice indefinitely. Factories that once exported manufactured goods now exported debt. They produced just enough to keep the country afloat, but not enough to compete. The world Britain had once controlled with trade, insurance, and shipping now belonged to the United States. The culture changed as well. People who had grown up believing they were the heirs of empire watched their children grow up believing they were the heirs of decline. Homes were small. Food was bland. Disposable income was rare. The austerity years were not a brief adjustment. They were the national lifestyle, and the government had a problem that could not be spoken publicly. The massive post-war loan from the United States and Canada was not just a financial burden, it was a structural trap. Britain owed billions, with interest, over decades. The only way to service that debt was to pursue policies that undermined Britain's ability to grow long-term. The debt forced high taxes, currency controls, suppressed wages, reduced investment, and constant budgetary caution. The state had to choose survival over development. The empire became a liability. Colonies were not sources of revenue, but drains on resources. Keeping them running cost money. Pulling troops out reduced costs. So independence wasn't just political evolution, it was financial triage. India went first, then Burma, then Ceylon, then Africa, then the Caribbean. Sometimes independence movements forced London's hand. Sometimes London simply walked away because it could no longer afford to stay. This retreat from empire coincided with the rise of the welfare state. The British government attempted to create fairness at home while losing power abroad. It was morally admirable and fiscally expensive. Healthcare, housing, education, pensions, social protections became national identity, but they also became permanent liabilities financed with borrowed money, shrinking industry, and a weak currency. Economists warned that Britain was running a modern state with a Victorian economy, a state that promised more than its productivity could deliver. Meanwhile, America surged forward. The United States was not dealing with bombed cities or rebuilt factories. It was building suburbia, consumer markets, highways, universities, and corporations that would dominate the world. While Britain rationed bread, America mass-produced abundance. By 1960, the United States was not just prosperous, it was global infrastructure. It had military bases on every continent. It had corporations in every market. And it had the currency that every government needed. The US dollar became the foundation of international finance, not because of an agreement, but because of reality. America had all the gold. America had all the industry. America had all the credit. And Britain paid the price for fighting a war it could not afford to win alone. The final insult came in 1947, when Britain was forced to abandon imperial preference. The trading system that had supported British manufacturers for a century was dismantled. This wasn't diplomacy, it was foreclosure. British industry, now unprotected, had to compete in open markets against American giants with newer technology, cheaper capital, and larger economies of scale. It wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't even a fight. It was a surrender. Through the 1950s, Britain stumbled from crisis to crisis. Periodic currency shortages, chronic trade deficits, recurring IMF negotiations. Every government, whether conservative or Labour, had to manage the same impossible equation. How do you provide prosperity to a population that expects it? Using an economy that cannot produce it? There was no easy answer, and there was no escape, because the debt remained. Britain owed billions of dollars in wartime obligations, not to enemy states, not to neutral observers, but to its closest ally. Interest payments continued through global recessions, oil shocks, inflation waves, political turmoil, and economic stagnation. The loan was a historical artifact that became a permanent budget line. Generations who never saw the war paid taxes to finance it. School teachers in the 1950s, factory workers in the 1970s, office employees in the 1990s. All of them funded a debt created by a government that no longer existed, for a war that no one alive had started. And then, at the very end of the 20th century, something surreal happened. Britain prepared to make its final payment. On December 29, 2006, the British Treasury wired the last installment of wartime debt to the United States and Canada, 60 years after Churchill wrote that letter, 60 years after the Blitz, 60 years after VE Day. The bill was finally paid. A war fought by millions had been financed by generations. It didn't destroy Britain physically. It destroyed it mathematically. Britain didn't collapse. It was amortized. It didn't lose its empire in a battle. It lost it in a ledger. The British Empire was not defeated by Hitler or Mussolini or Tojo. It was dismantled by accountants, clauses, loans, interest rates, convertibility requirements, and market competition. Wars are violent, but bankruptcy is permanent. Britain sacrificed its past to protect Europe's future, and in doing so, it sacrificed its own. America emerged not as Britain's successor, but as its creditor. The transfer of power was not ceremonial. It was transactional. The United States didn't inherit global dominance. It purchased it, not with tanks, not with invasions, but with credit. And Britain, exhausted, indebted, and dependent, never fully recovered. When Churchill wrote that desperate letter in 1940, he believed he was saving civilization. And he was. But he was also signing a contract. A contract that guaranteed the survival of Britain and the death of its empire. History remembers the speeches, the battles, the parades, but the real story of victory is captured in accounting books, signed agreements, and interest payments that lasted for 6 decades. Britain won the war. America won the peace. And the price of that victory was paid years after year by people who never knew they were paying it. If this story opened your eyes to a part of history nobody talks about, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. New videos are coming that reveal how global power, wealth, and debt continue to shape our world today, and subscribing is the only way to stay ahead of it.